Ladies and gentlemen. May I ask for the live stream to begin, please? Okay, so we are now streaming a live broadcast. So welcome members and the public to the council meeting, which is being held in Caudle Hall at the Welford Noise Community Centre, as it is not possible for the full council to meet together in the council chamber at the council offices, whilst maintaining appropriate social distancing to reduce the risk of COVID infection. Councillors are supported this evening by Strategic Director Graham Clark, Strategic Director Annie Wrighton, the Head of Policy and Governance Robin Taylor, the Borough Solicitor Daniel Bainbridge, and the HR Manager Sally Kipping, and the Democratic Services and Business Support Team Manager Louise Fleming. Members, please raise your hand to indicate that you wish to speak, and you will be operating your own microphones. If you are unable to hear anything, please indicate that to me. I can also confirm that we are live streaming the meeting this evening. Speeches will be timed at 4 minutes, and you will be given a 30-second warning before your time is up. Members may only speak once on each item, except in limited circumstances as set out in Procedure Rule 14.5. So I'm going to begin the agenda with item 1, apologies for absence. Robin Taylor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We've received apologies from Councillors Steve Cossar, Kevin Denas, Brian Edmonds, Jan Floyd Douglas, Mary Foroshevsky, John Gray, Maxine Gale, George Hess, Daniel Hunt, Kika Merrilees, and Julia Potts.
Yeah. Have there been any declarations prior to the meeting of interest?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The Chief Executive has declared an interest in item 3 on the agenda and is therefore not present at the meeting this evening.
Thank you. So we'll now go on to the agenda item 3, appointment to the post of Joint Chief Executive. Members, please ensure that during the course of debate, you do not refer to any material contained in the exempt papers, which you will find on pages 9 and 10 at the rear of your agenda. If members wish to refer to any of this information, the meeting must resolve to exclude the press and the public. If I might ask the leader, please, to introduce this item.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good evening, members. You have before you this evening recommendations that derive from the decisions made by this council on the 6th of July, at which we determined as a council to pursue a single joint chief executive for Waverley Borough Council and Guildford Borough Council. That session also created and empowered the Joint Appointments Committee to follow an HR process to this end and delegated authority to make recommendations back to council. The WBC reps for this committee were myself, Councillor Clark, and Councillor Mulliner, and I do want to thank them both at this time for their constructive contributions throughout the process, and also to our colleagues at Guildford Borough Council who made up the other half of the Joint Appointments Committee. That process has now taken place and the recommendations from it are before you. Like many of you, I work in the private sector and have been involved in hiring many times before, including many senior posts. Local government, as always, brings its own fairly unique processes and rules. And in particular, I want to thank our external advisors from South East Employers, particularly Jennifer McNeil, for all of her help. And of course, Sally Kipping, whose advice and guidance has been invaluable throughout this process. Now, having been part of that process, I can attest that it was robust, professional, and with sufficient rigour to justify the recommendations that have been made. And to be clear, it is on the appointment and not upon the collaboration that a decision is to be taken this evening. My very first day as a councillor, when I was first elected back in 2017, was the full council in December that year that appointed Tom Horwood to the position of Chief Executive of Waverley Borough Council. And over that time, I've worked with Tom as a member of the executive, and now as leader. And I'm confident that he is the right choice for this collaboration, that he understands and brings a level of expertise to the particular objective of that collaboration. And that expertise is considerable and relevant. And I voted for Tom's appointment back in 2017. Now, I heartily support his appointment for the expanded role this evening, and I commend those recommendations to council and certainly ask that you consider this in the spirit that it is meant, in particular to the HR appointment in front of you, and that this, I hope, is an uncontroversial decision for all members and will benefit both Waverley Borough Council and Guildford Borough Council and the residents of both of those boroughs for many years to come. Thank you, members, and thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Follows. Have we a seconder?
Happy to second, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor. I will now ask for speakers to the motion. Councillor Mulliner.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. The Conservative Group has considered this carefully and will wish Tom Horwood very well if his appointment is approved by the Council and Guildford Borough Council, on the principle that anyone appointed to a post should receive support and encouragement, especially when the post is expected to be a challenging one. But we will not vote in favour of the appointment solely because of our grave concerns about the underlying rationale of the collaboration project which has led to this appointment, and our serious objections to the process by which it has been arrived at. The basic premise of the collaboration is to save money. However, the prospect of significant savings is not even likely. The local partnerships consultancy report could only see scope for the annual revenue savings for both councils combined of less than 1.5 million, or less than 2% of their gross general fund expenditure. This is far less than would be considered even remotely acceptable in industry and other parts of the private sector. What is more, half of these very modest savings depend on making redundant up to 9 senior managers, while the other half are regarded by our own officers as largely illusory. Redundancy savings are not cost or risk-free. The senior managers who remain will be required to manage many more staff with different cultures, different pay arrangements, and in waste collection and estate management, 2 entirely different methods of working: direct service for Guildford and contracted out for Waverley. Strong leadership and good staff management are always important, and doubling a senior manager's workload carries the risk of significant staff turmoil and turnover. If this leads to the widespread use of agency staff to maintain services, the assumed revenue savings will be eroded and could even be extinguished and reversed. But we have equally strong objections to the way this has been done. It has been rushed. Most local government mergers take years in the making. However, this project was first mentioned in February of this year, and nothing more was heard outside of the executive until June, when a presentation on the 16th was followed by an executive meeting on the 22nd of June, in which the leader even introduced, without notice to his colleagues, a new option for the appointment of a single chief executive. There was then one rather token overview and scrutiny meeting on the 29th, then a council decision on the 6th of July. Such a headlong and ill-considered process for perhaps the most important strategic decision this council has ever taken in its lifetime makes a mockery of the scrutiny process and completely abandons the concept of careful consideration of major proposals. If given adequate notice, the scrutiny function would have sought to act as a critical friend by comparing the sought-after benefits with their likelihood of achievement and the alternative of seeking to solve Waverley's future budget deficit by increasing income, as now addressed, of course, by the new parking strategy. Then no risk assessment has been carried out. Assembling a list of risks is not the same as carrying out an assessment when the likelihood and impact of each is considered. If such an assessment had been carried out, it would have been an obvious subject to scrutiny by one of the overview and scrutiny committees. No inter-authority agreement has yet been provided, merely a skeleton. When one thinks that the chief executive is actually someone who has been at Havant in East Hampshire.
Thank you, Councillor Mulliner. Your time's up. Can you?
I will be very brief. And my last point is simply prematurity. This should have waited until at least the end of this council year, and that would have given us a far better chance to understand how extensive the recovery from the pandemic had been. Then would have been a better time to have taken this decision. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
And Councillor Mulliner. Councillor Seaborn.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councillor Mulliner has raised a series of issues relating to why there have been concerns with the process that has led us to today's meeting which is sadly a coronation and not the culmination of a full selection process. I'd like to expand further on the issue of risk. I spoke at the July 6th meeting of Council, pointing out that taking a list of risks prepared by a consultancy is in no way the same as risk assessment or risk management. Clearly wasted breath, because on page 4 of our papers, it is stated that the papers at that meeting included an initial risk analysis. Risk analysis requires estimation of the probability and severity of a risk outcome. These aspects were not and have not been addressed. Indeed, the papers on July the 6th stated, listing these risks does not mean that they are all very likely. If the partnership develops, officers will need to develop the strategic risk assessment with more quantifiable metrics depending on the option pursued. Well, here we are, pursuing an option, and yet no further risk work appears to have been undertaken. Contained within our constitution are the council's financial regulations. There are several items in those regulations that require more risk management than has happened in this exercise. Firstly, in section 3.11, and I quote, "The executive is responsible for proposing the policy framework and budget to the full council. In doing so, it shall take account of legal and financial implications and risk management issues that may arise from decisions." And then secondly, in section 12, which relates to partnerships, the following is stated. Prior to the council committing to enter a service, contractual or financial partnership, the risks involved in the following items shall be considered. The responsibilities and commitment of the council, any financial obligations entered into, the governance arrangements, and any liabilities or insurance requirements. Preparing a list of risks is no more than the first partial step in consideration of risk. So despite the profound shortcomings of the process, particularly in terms of risk management, I will also wish Tom Horwood well if his appointment is approved by this council and Guildford Borough Council, on the principle that anyone appointed to a new position should receive support and encouragement. But I will not be voting in favour of the appointment because of the failings of the underlying rationale for the collaboration project and the flawed process which has got us to that point. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
And Councillor Seaborn. Councillor Hyman.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is a great opportunity for both Guildford Borough Council and Waverley Borough Council to turn over a new leaf. I do agree with a lot of what's been said by Councillor Mulliner and Councillor Seaborn. I think it's a missed opportunity here. I don't think that turning over a new leaf is what is before us. There are numerous reasons, but I would just like to ask, in respect of recommendation 2 on our page 2 of our agenda document before us, which tells us that the above appointment be confirmed once contract negotiations have finalised. Normally, whenever I've done deals in the past or employed people, it has been on the basis that the terms were agreed. I wouldn't want to make a decision without agreeing the terms first of all. I don't know whether it would be correct for all of us as members to have sight of those terms in advance, and whether that would be usual, but I think it's unusual that we're making a decision before the terms have been agreed. And I would like to know, who are they going to be confirmed by? Who are they going to be confirmed to? Why is that there? Because if, presumably, if the negotiations on our part, if we're turning around as members saying, yes, we're fine, whatever the terms are, then we are putting all of the cards into someone else's hands, giving them complete control over us. I wouldn't agree to that. So if you could please explain properly why the appointment needs to be confirmed once contract negotiations have been finalised, who it is that's going to confirm it, whether that is going to be delegated or whether we will make that decision in this room or another room. And certainly I would not agree to any decision such as this without seeing the terms. Thank you.
And Councillor Hyman, is there anybody else wishes to speak? Two. Thank you. Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would merely like to remind my colleagues why we are in the position of being financially strapped. It is not a decision that has been taken lightly, I am sure, but with the withdrawal of all the support virtually that we gained from the government and the cost of the pandemic, which has not been fully covered, we are in a position where we actually have to do something in haste. It might not be ideal, but it's something that will maybe stop us becoming a Surrey-wide unitary authority as well, which again is government policy. So we are not here because we want to be here. We're here because we have to be here. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Wilson. Councillor Merriweather.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I wasn't planning on speaking, but I just wanted to pick up on a couple of comments that have been made by various members here. Starting with the rationale for what's going on here. I'm always sceptical at the moment to hear people talking about recovery from COVID. As though it's a given done deal and it's all we've got to do is sit there and it'll come along and everything will be just fine and dandy. Even before COVID, we faced an extremely serious budgetary situation. Councillor Mulliner was chairman of the Budget Strategy Working Group, which looked into this and failed to come up with the answers even then as to how we were going to balance our budget over the medium term, and things have got a lot worse since then. The Office of Budget Responsibility last week told us that CPI inflation is going to peak at 4.4% next year and will continue to keep it at that level, certainly over 2% for 4 or 5 years. Our budgets and our medium-term financial plans, even up until this February, were based around containing inflation within the 2% target. So our costs are going to go through the roof. We've already had the first impact of that with the health and social care levy, without the slightest idea how much of £130,000 this year we're going to get back. Rather, we're entering a period of even greater uncertainty over our revenue streams because we don't have a funding settlement. We don't know what's going to happen with retained business rates. Our revenue streams from the property investment strategy are heavily curtailed by the regulatory environment. I was surprised to hear Councillor Mulliner compare us to the private sector. The private sector would not and could not tolerate the regulatory handcuffs that we have to operate under. We live in a much more contained world. We don't have any of the luxuries that the private sector has, and we operate under rules and regulations set by government that the private sector wouldn't tolerate. So those are just some comments I wanted to make about the situation. As far as the process is concerned, there's a great deal of speculation about where what we're talking about tonight may lead, but what we're talking about with Tom's appointment, I think is a reasonable and appropriate first step, a very necessary step for the exploration of collaboration, one that is even more important and even more urgent than it was when it was first contemplated and put in our budget papers back in February. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Merriweather. Councillor Townsend.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have to say that I totally agree with Councillor Merriweather that this is a very reasonable, timely and necessary appointment. And I think the Conservative group is completely out of touch. I think that residents will no doubt think that savings of £1.5 million is considerable, and they are facing extremely difficult times ahead at the moment, and possibly with interest rates also rising. You know, Councillor Mulliner mentioned about the business, but this is, as Councillor Merriweather has said, a local authority reliant on dwindling government funding. Our expenses from COVID, despite assurances from the government that nobody would be out of pocket, that is not the case. And we are still in the middle of that pandemic. And I think that, you know, we have to recognise that whilst people think things are, you know, going perhaps through in a quick way, I think, as I said a moment ago, I think it's very necessary. I think that the pandemic is still here and things are moving very, very quickly for residents. You know, with universal credit being the £20 per week now being abolished, with residents facing council tax rises potentially, with residents facing national insurance tax rises. The list is endless and we have to respond accordingly. And that might seem to be in a quick fashion, but it is completely and utterly necessary. And I would like to point out as well that Councillor Mulliner was also on the panel. And, you know, and I'm surprised that, you know, the points he's raised tonight, that he wasn't able to cover those off during this whole process. And I'm really disappointed in that. I completely support this appointment and, you know, the risk that have been pointed out by Councillor Seaborne. I would just like to say that, you know, we have been assured throughout this process that this is not an uncommon practice. It is not something strange and bizarre. It is quite normal for there to be joint chief executives of councils, and I wholeheartedly support the appointment this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Townsend. Councillor Martin, then Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The process, in my view, to appoint the joint chief executive has been wrong. We have, in effect...
Point of order, Mr. Mayor.
I will give way.
Councillor Folland.
Under Article 14(4) of the Constitution, members are required to stick to the agenda and the questions upon it that are raised, whilst out of respect to certainly the Leader of the Opposition and many other members who wish to talk about matters involving their collaboration. That is actually not the item on the agenda, and so I request my point of order, Mr. Mayor.
I would agree with that, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I was going to talk about the selection process, which I think is a perfectly reasonable thing for this group to be talking about.
Can you stick to that then, please?
I will certainly do so, as I intended. The selection process is a curious one. The selection process, we had two candidates for this position, one of whom withdrew, so effectively we only had one candidate, and that candidate, in fact, was selected. My view is that we should have had a more open process where candidates from outside would also be considered, so that we could then consider more than one candidate and be sure that the candidate we've chosen is the very best one that we could have found. I have no doubt that this group will, in fact, endorse the appointment, and I will congratulate the new chief executive in the way that others have said. But I still have considerable reservations as to the start of this particular process, and I believe that we should have had outside candidates so that we could properly compare the candidate that has been selected with those outside candidates. And I think that's a deep flaw in the process. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Martin. Councillor Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We're looking at two separate things here. One is the process and the decision to appoint a joint executive, and the other is who that should be. And only the second point is actually on the agenda. We have previously discussed the merging of the senior level of officers, and the views of various members on that are well known. If we were to explore it, then I think the public would be interested to know what increases in council tax or reductions in services they would propose in order to make up for not having the savings that a rapid appointment will provide. But as we're not discussing that, I won't go into that, and we'll just say that I think the point on the agenda is that Mr. Hallwood would be suitable, and my experience of working with him is that he is eminently suitable. So I don't think it should be controversial, and I look forward to supporting it.
Thank you, Councillor Palmer. Councillor Baker.
Thank you, Mayor. I would like to address the point of the fact that there's been no competition from outside candidates. I would just remind the speaker who suggested that route should have been followed, that there's a very sound motto: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I am talking about the qualities of Mr. Hallwood, for whom I have great admiration. And when you think what lies before us, it is potentially, it is very much better to have someone who is tried and tested in post and whose qualities are clearly and have been clearly demonstrated, rather than go out to recruit somebody who may be all very well on paper and on interview, but who will not have performed in the role of chief executive here. And so I would really say that I think there was absolutely no reason to go out to extend the recruitment process to other candidates. Thank you.
And Councillor Baker, I see no other hands being up. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'd just like to respond to the suggestion that it would be better to wait until the end of this council's term. Well, we're already going backwards in our financial position. If we waited another 18 months, the council might be in a more perilous state. So,
Slight point of information, I actually said the end of the council year.
oh, thank you.
Carry on, Councillor.
I stand corrected. But we simply can't afford to wait. And I think for anybody to suggest that we should is living in a parallel universe. Thank you.
And Councillor Clark. I can't see other hands. No, sorry, Councillor Harman.
Point of order, please, Mr. Mayor. I did ask a question as to what who's going to confirm what, because we're actually confirming
Councillor Hyman,
this evening.
the
Can I have an answer?
leader will sum up and respond.
Thank you.
Right, leader, if I could ask you please to respond and sum up, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Before I do that, with your consent, could I ask Sally Kipping, the HR manager, to respond to a couple of the points from Councillor Hyman, as I think that would be most appropriate rather than from me, with your consent.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So as I understand it, Councillor Hyman's question was around the negotiation of terms and conditions for the contract, the joint chief executive role. Most terms and conditions are relatively straightforward. There are in fact existing Waverley Borough Council terms and conditions. And of course, the main point, that of the salary, has already been agreed in full council. So that just sort of leaves who we need to negotiate with. Of course, in a contract of offer and acceptance, the person we're really negotiating with is the person who has to accept the contract. In this case, Tom Hallwood as joint chief executive. So the negotiations rather reflect his need to accept the contract as we place before him, which of course won't happen until we do place that contract before him. There were a few details that needed to be compatible with Guildford and to just make sure that we covered those off, and we have done that. So a draft contract has been prepared to place before Mr. Horwood and obtain his agreement. I hope that clarifies the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Follows.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And just to reassure Councillor Hyman also that the primary sort of scope of the contract was actually something we discussed at that prior council meeting. So in terms of the key points regarding maximum salary and other parts of the key contract terms, that was actually set, there were maximum limits set for that by council. It may now, Mr. Mayor, respond to some of the points made. Much of Councillor Martin's point is answered by one made by Councillor Merriweather. Much of this process is defined externally by law, and the individual, this is actually just like any HR employment opportunity, if you're doing it how you should do it in the way the law intends, is to compare the individual to the role and not to other individuals. And that's just how the process works. The decision that we've got tonight is actually about the appointment, and it's an appointment that actually saves money within the life of the administration. We're actually talking about just this specific appointment here, and it saves money in the life of this administration. It does not double the workload of staff in the same way that commercial economies of scale are not multipliers of effort. They're in fact the opposite. Now, actually, I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his acknowledgement of the efficiency of which we have undertaken this extremely complicated process at a time of COVID, at a time of budget constraints. We have done this very quickly, but we've also done it correctly and in a robust way. I will just also say thank you to Councillor Wilson for your interjection and reminding us why we are all here, and to Councillors Townsend and Merriweather for putting this into the proper context. Now, Councillor Mullen, I was not intending to make this overly political, and it's certainly not my intent to do so now, but once again, we hear this fixation upon process, and once again, the critique of councillors who are trying to save money as your Conservative central government continues to starve local government for funding. As ever, no new ideas, no alternatives, no plan, just critique of those who are trying to do right by residents in the face of these significant structural challenges. But let's bring it back to the recommendations in front of us tonight. These recommendations are clear, they're robust, they're correct, and for an individual that I believe firmly, and the Joint Appointments Committee believe firmly, can do the job. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor, and I again commend these recommendations to Council.
Thank you, Leader. There are two recommendations which will be taken together, and these are set out in the report. Is that agreed? Thank you. In that case, the recommendation is approved. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Point of order.
Mr. Mayor,
voting on?
Mr. Mayor, I believe that members thought that was an agreement to take the recommendations together rather than a vote on the motion itself. My apologies.
Then I do apologise. It looks clear down here. So we've agreed to take them together. That's fine. All those, let's see a show of hands, please. All those that do agree. All those against? And those abstaining? That motion is passed. Thank you. Have you the numbers?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. That's 28 for, 1 against and 14 abstentions.
Are you sure?
I thought I saw 2 against. I think there were 2 against. Can I see those hands for against, please?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. That's 2 against.
Thank you. Then that recommendation is passed. Thank you. So we move on to agenda item 4, the appointment of chairman to Overview and Scrutiny Committee. In accordance with the Overview and Scrutiny Committee procedure rules, the council is asked to agree the appointment of Councillor Stephen Mulner as chairman of the Policy Overview and Scrutiny Committee and Councillor Kevin Denis as chairman of the Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
In that case, the agreement is recommended. It's there, it's passed. Thank you very much. There are no further parts of the meeting, so please That's the end of the meeting. Thank you all very much for coming along. And I congratulate Mr. Horwood.